So Daniel, welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. We're so excited to hear from you today.
Thank you so much, you all, for having me. And thank you, Kathy, for the introduction.
Well, we are just excited to have you. And we were wondering if you might want to start with just a few opening comments and tell us maybe a little bit about your story and just your opening thoughts on socialism and the economics of socialism.
Yeah. Well, let me start by telling you a little bit about myself. As Kathy said, I'm doing a PhD in economics now at Columbia. I've been almost 6 years in the United States. And when I came to America, I was 17 years old, almost 18. I had just graduated high school in Venezuela. And by the time I left Venezuela, the country was very different from when I was born. I was born in 1999. That is the same year that Hugo Chavez, the tyrant who then passed away, took over. And from that point until today, Venezuela has suffered a radical transformation because of the policies implemented by him and his handpicked successor, the current dictator, Nicolas Maduro. My family went from being an upper middle class family in Venezuela, making $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 a month, depending on the month, owning a gas station in central Venezuela, to, like most Americans today would make, right? To making less than $100 a month by the time I left Venezuela in 2016. So imagine, put that in your head, right? That how do you go from being middle class to being extremely poor? And the truth is that happened because of the policies implemented by the regime. Not only that, but Caracas, where I lived, the capital of Venezuela, is the city with the highest murder rate on the planet. So it's not only a place where people are starving because of lack of income and lack of food, but it's also extremely dangerous: homicide, kidnapping, robbery. And in addition to that, even if you have money to buy things, you used to have, at least when I was there, things have changed and we can talk about that. But you used to have to line up for hours to buy most things. I would lose electricity. There would be a blackout in my home at least once a week in 2016, in 2015, 2014. Sometimes we would not have water services in my apartment for several weeks straight. We had a water tank in our building. So water came from outside, right? The government owned the water services. Water would go into the tank would get full, and then the government would stop providing us water for, say, 3 weeks. And so we would have to ration ourselves the water we had in the tank, get it from the rain, however we could, treat it, and that would be the only way to obtain water. And sometimes my dad became the president of the homeowners association, and we would have to just be able to have water services 1 hour per day, that, in the morning to shower, and that's it. And people would just do their laundry and everything in that hour. It was pretty rough, right? In a country that should be more like Dubai or a country that back in the 1950s was the 4th richest country on the planet, right? And it was so different. So let me tell you about what happened to Venezuela. How did it go from being the 4th richest country on the planet in the 1950s, the richest in Latin America even when I was born, to being the poorest in Latin America, one of the poorest in the planet. Today, out of 30 million Venezuelans who lived in the country in 2011, 6 million of us have left the country. We're talking about over 20% of the population is outside of the country. That is an astounding number. That is almost the same number of people who have left Syria. But in Venezuela, there are no chemical weapons being used against the population. There is no war where there's bombings or terrorist attacks. Yet, as the same number of people have left Venezuela, they have left Syria. How can it be so bad, right? And this is why we have to understand what socialism is and what it does to your country. Okay, many people will come up with things like, oh, Venezuela is not socialist, or these are not socialist policies. So let's talk about what happened. Venezuela in the 1970s was the 10th most economically free country in the world, according to the Fraser Institute. That is, it was the country with the lowest taxes, lowest government spending, less regulation. It was easy to start a business. That's what we generally consider to be capitalist. So it was 10th in the world in the 70s. Today, Venezuela is, if not the second to last, the third to last country in the world for economic freedom. So it is one of the most socialist countries, right? You have to think about it as a spectrum, right? Where there's the most free market to the least free market or the most socialist. And Venezuela went from one end to the other. And in that period, it went from very rich to very poor. And now, of course, correlation is not causation, but it is causation, what happened in our country. You see, the government implemented price controls. That is, it told businesses how much they could charge for things. And if I tell you, say that you want to sell bread, it costs you $1 per loaf for you to buy it as a business owner, you're not going to sell it below $1, right? And if the government tells you, you have to sell it for 50 cents, what are you going to do? You're not going to sell it. And that's exactly what happened in Venezuela. The government came in and told businesses, you have to charge this amount. It was not profitable, so businesses stopped working. And when that happened, the very few things that were available, we had to line up for them and we had to fight for them, really. My family, my dad sometimes had to fight, one time for toilet paper in the supermarket. And people have died in Venezuela fighting for things in grocery stores. It's pathetic, really, what happened in a country that was so rich. The country with the largest oil reserves on the planet, right? We should be the richest country in the world if you talk about it for natural resources, and we're not. Milton Friedman used to say, the famous Nobel Prize winning economist, that if you gave the government the Sahara Desert, you would face a shortage of sand in 5 years. The Sahara Desert that has almost infinite sand. The truth is that we gave in Venezuela, the government, the largest oil reserves on the planet, and we had a shortage of gasoline. Today, there is a shortage of gasoline in Venezuela, despite having so much oil, because what really makes a country rich is not what's underground. It's what people are free to do with their minds and with their labor. And that's why the United States is a rich country. And that's why the countries that are rich are rich. It's not because of the resources they have. It's because people are free to pursue their own dreams and destinies. When the government tells you that you have to charge this much for your business, or when the government comes in and actually takes over your business, or it taxes you 90% of your income, and it chooses what to do with what people earn, you're less free as a result. And because you are less free, you are transferring decision power from you to the government. And who knows? And this is a question about incentives, and that's what economics is all about. That's why I decided to study economics. Who knows better what you need to eat today and tomorrow? You, not the government. Imagine if we gave the government the job to determine how much food you need, when you need it, where do you need it. It would be impossible. And that's why Venezuela failed. Then the government decided that to help the poor, they were going to just print money and give things for free. Electricity that we didn't have many times was free. Water was free. Gasoline was almost free in Venezuela as well. They gave housing for free. They started creating all these free universities. And as a result, the government had to print so much money that it created inflation. So much inflation that's why our family went from being middle class to being poor, right? Because we're making the same amount of money or nearly the same amount of money, and the prices kept rising. So in dollar terms, if you adjust for inflation, we were worse off. You'd wonder, well, why does printing money create inflation? Well, if you do this excessively, what happens? The government starts printing all this money. There's more demand. People want to buy more things because they have all this cash in their hands, and the country cannot produce more because the government is restricting production, right? Because it's, controlling businesses, taxing them and all of these things. And because they can't increase production, if there's more demand and the same supply, prices are going to go up. And so that's exactly what happened in our country. The government started hiring millions of people that stopped being productive workers in the private sector and became government workers. There was this very famous government agency they created called the Vice Ministry for Supreme Social Happiness. That is how ridiculous they named it. And it's a real thing. And there's many ministries like this. There's also the Ministry for Eco-Socialism, ecological and socialism, all these things, even though we have terrible oil spills in our country. And what was the consequence? Why did they create so many things? Because the government wanted to get votes Unlike a private business that wants to maximize profit, so they want to innovate, they want to, increase production, they want to cut costs and do things as efficiently as possible and expand to make more money, which also means hiring more employees to make more money. The government just wants to hire more people, not make them work because that would be unpopular, and charge as little as possible. And who covers the deficit of all of that? Who covers the bill? The taxpayer. And so the taxpayers, us, everybody really in the country was spoiled by the government through that. And that was a really terrible consequence. Now, people will tell you, and this is where you need to refute them, and it's very easy to do so, that what happened in Venezuela is because the oil price went down, or it's because it's a corrupt regime, or it's because of US sanctions. And there's a very easy way to refute the three arguments. One, it's that it's not true, of course, but let me give you an analogy to show you why that's not true. Iran is an authoritarian regime dependent on oil, just as Venezuela. It's one of the largest oil producers in the world. And it's much more heavily sanctioned by the United States than Venezuela. You can't even send a piece of mail to Iran, okay? Venezuelans send food, money, toilet paper, everything all the time, from Miami to Caracas, door to door. There are companies that send things from America to Venezuela. It's totally allowed, legal, and done all the time. You cannot do that in Iran. So why aren't millions of Iranians fleeing their country? And why are millions of Venezuelans fleeing our country? Why? Because Iran may be authoritarian. It's even a religiously authoritarian regime that Venezuela is not. But Iran is not a socialist country. Iran didn't take away people's businesses. Iran didn't impose price controls on everything. Iran didn't start printing millions and millions and millions % of their, in cash to pay for their bills. That is the difference. So yes, Iran is a terrible place because of its authoritarianism, but it is not as bad as Venezuela because it is not a socialist country. And that's why millions of people didn't flee Iran. And so how do you explain that a country that has more sanctions than Venezuela, it's oil dependent like Venezuela, and it's just as corrupt because it's a very, authoritarian dictatorship? How are they not doing that bad? How are people not starving in Iran to death like in Venezuela? Think of the rest of Latin America. Do you think Venezuela is the only corrupt country in the world? Learn about what happens in Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia, in the rest of Latin America. Corruption is not just a thing in Venezuela, it's everywhere. But people don't starve because there are a few corrupt politicians. People starve because the government deprives them of their freedom. And that happened in Venezuela. And that's what socialism is about. Government control and less freedom for individuals. And that's why we have to fight it. So because that's what's made America prosperous, the freedom that we have. And if they take it from us, then God forbid we end up like Venezuela. So I'm very happy to answer your questions, about my experience, about what happened in Venezuela, or anything else you want. So thanks so much for the chance to talk, guys.
Oh, I'm Janine Turner, founder, co-president. I get to go first. I'm so excited. Wow. What an amazing testimony. And it's a firsthand testimony. And I think that's why, and thank you for what you're doing and how you've dedicated your life to spreading the word about this. You're sort of the Paul Revere, right? The British are coming, socialists are coming, socialists are coming. But to hear your testimony firsthand is, I think, extraordinarily powerful. I'm amazed you're allowed on college campuses with this message, but I'm glad you are. Because it's different than just having someone else say it, that this is, a third person, your firsthand. That Milton Friedman quote is amazing. Give the government the Sierra Desert and they'll run out of sand. Oh gosh. Anyway, I thought what you said, that it would be unpopular. It told people they didn't have to work because it's unpopular, if they told people they had to work. But what a harrowing experience and story, and about taking away people's freedom and the ability for markets to compete, and also for people to be able to achieve their dreams. I think that it's wonderful that Constituting America is doing this chat, and that also we have a fabulous guest such as yourself, because socialism sounds like utopia. Communism sounds like utopia. And yet in actuality, it's not. And it's really, I thought, very powerful how you broke down it wasn't, sanctions. It wasn't because it was a dictator. Very, very thorough presentation there. I can't talk for too long because I have to pass it off to everybody else. But my question for you would be, talk to us about the difference between socialism and communism for the young viewers that are watching, because it sounds to me very much like it was almost communist. And expound a little bit about the sort of utopian view that socialism is a great thing that everybody will be taken care of. If you'll just talk about those 2 points very briefly, please.
Yeah, so I'm going to tell you first, this is not according to me, this is according to Karl Marx himself, the founder of this ideology, right, through the Communist Manifesto. Communism is the end goal of socialism. Communism really can never happen if you think about it. Communism is the state where there's no government and people share everything equally. It was the Marxist end goal, that you wouldn't even need a government at all, that people would just share property commonly, right? You wouldn't own your house, it would be commonly owned. Nobody would own a factory, the workers would, and nobody would buy and trade property like that. There would be no money in the economy. And people just, take things that they need and be honest and, not work because of desire, not because they actually want to make money and buy things. And so it's an ideology. It's an idea that it just goes against human nature. Humans invented property because it's natural to us to own property. We want to own our house. We don't want to have to share it anytime that somebody else wants to come into our house. I view no problem with that. So that's why I disagree with the fundamental idea that communism is a utopia. I think it's a terrible idea, even in theory. I don't think everybody must be equal or not have to work to eat and things like that. So that's what communism is. Socialism is what Marx thought was the only way to achieve communism. And that is, we still have a government, and because humans are corrupt, right? This human nature that I'm telling you, that we are not communists, we like property and we like to own things and work for the things that we want to buy, then that's the terrible man. We need to create a new man, was Marx's goal. And to do that, we need to have the government take over everything, own everything, punish people who dissent and who think differently and who are the bourgeoisie, right? That's how they called us too in Venezuela. We were the bourgeoisie, we were the escuálidos, was the word that Chavez used against us, because we wanted property. At the same time, they were saying, being rich is bad, Chavez used to say, despite having a Rolex at the same time he said that on his hand, on his wrist. That is the hypocrisy of socialists. And so socialism is basically government control over the means of production, while communism is the end goal, that you wouldn't even need the government to force us. That's never going to happen. You're always going to need the government to force us. And that's why socialism always ends up in mass murder, right? Because it goes against human nature. People will resist it. And it will result in that, or, people will flee, which is what happens in Cuba, in North Korea, in Nicaragua, in Eritrea, in the former Soviet Union, in China before Deng Xiaoping. And that's the difference. In theory, it's not good either. We're not equal. We don't want to be equal. I don't want to be equal to others. I have different preferences. You have different preferences. So you may want to be a doctor. I want to be an economist, and I don't want the government to have to decide those things for us. I think that you are more capable of making your own decisions.
People just want to be able to get out of bed in the morning and have a reason to get out of bed. And all this, and have a purpose for their life. And to be able to pursue that purpose. But when you take away people's motivation and hope, it creates a very despondent society. Why get up? Why go do anything? And then the more you lay around, the more you want to lie around. It's just the human nature. Okay, I want to turn it over to Tova. I'm going to ask a brief question first, though. France is supposedly socialist. And so would people not look to that and say, well, France is still really, beautiful. Looks pretty cool.
Okay. So, right. This goes back to the point that there are degrees of free markets and freedom, right? France is definitely much more socialist than the United States. but it is certainly not Venezuela. The French government doesn't tell businesses how much to charge or own most French businesses. The difference is that in France, taxes are much higher. The government does get more involved in business regulating them. But what's the result in France? France has double the unemployment of the United States all the time. About 30 to 40% of young people in France are unemployed. In the United States, it's less than 10%. And in France, people make a lot less money than in the United States. An average worker or even the working class makes a lot less money in France. Heck, they don't even have washer and dryers in most French households. In the United States, people do have dryers for their clothes because electricity is so expensive, and they don't view it as an essential thing. So, if you prefer that system and you prefer to be poorer because you would have some sort of better safety net, that might be a trade-off. I think, the Scandinavian countries are better trade-offs than France. I think France is a terrible country to look at. The Scandinavian countries do have higher taxation than the United States, more similar to France, though not as much as France, I'll say. But the difference is that they regulate businesses much less than both France or the United States. And so they're able to trade off better, safety versus average incomes in the Nordic countries.
Interesting. Your taxes in France, I think, are extraordinarily high, like 80%,
yes.
Right?
Most workers pay over 50% of their income in total taxation.
Mm-hmm. It was really
in the United States, low-income workers don't pay taxes. Like on net, they don't pay anything in taxes. That's the difference. So actually, when people talk about redistribution of income, the United States has the most redistributed tax system in the developed world. That is, the United States actually taxes the rich like Europe. The difference is that the poor are untaxed in this country, and in Europe, they tax them a lot. So in Europe, what happens, especially in the Nordic countries or in Germany or the UK, is that they take money from you and then they give it back to you in some sort of, pensions or health benefits and things like that. In the United States, you're really taking money from the high income people and giving it to the low income people. And that's, we don't have a 20% sales tax. We don't have a 30% payroll tax, which is the big difference with the European countries and America. It's not the top tax bracket.
Interesting. Wow. Could talk to you forever. But I have to pass it on. I can't hog all the time. All right. So Tova, I'm turning it over to you. Thank you, Daniel. Truly.
Yeah, thank you so much, Daniel, for being on and telling your story. I think it's so important to hear from people firsthand. It kind of cuts through the different ideologies and tells human stories. So I was wondering, just historically, why did Venezuela move towards socialism and in such a drastic fashion, where you were saying, you really put it into perspective that in the 1970s, it was the 10th most free country versus now. Like, why did they make that shift? What drove that?
Yeah, well, this is classic in resource-rich countries. The government wants to expand. Somebody gets elected that wants to give free things because the government is like that, and there are no constitutional constraints on the government expanding. The difference is in the United States, there's a lot of constitutional constraints on the government expanding. Don't think that it's not that we couldn't have gone that way. We just had a different legal framework here and a different history. In Venezuela, in the 1970s, oil was nationalized, and that was the first step towards big government expansion. That provided the government with a lot of revenue, but it also tanked our oil industry. The moment that Venezuela produced the most oil was before nationalization, back in the 60s. And after that, production has never reached that peak again. In the 90s, it was privatized again. It recovered, but then Chavez came in and renationalized it. Why did all of this happen? Really, it's political incentives. The government tends to grow. Politicians would rather grow government if we don't put constraints on them. Venezuela was a young democracy with not the same history of freedom and the United States was founded by people who rebelled against taxation. I mean, it's a totally different history, right? So that was not the case of Venezuela. Venezuela became democratic in 1958, right? And it stayed democratic until like 1999. So democracy only lasted for 40 years, really. And so that's what happened during Chavez. First, he was elected, right? And he started, the first thing he did was change the constitution. How did he change it? He and I think this goes to one of the questions here, how did the government enforce laws like socialism? The reality was that Chavez couldn't change the constitution except through an amendment process like in America. He didn't have the votes to do that. So he decided that he could invent himself a new way to change it, which was to totally rewrite it and just put it up to a referendum nationally. That was not an amendment that was allowed. And so he packed the Supreme Court. He changed the Supreme Court justices. He put it up to their decision, and then they were all his friends, and they voted to say, yes, you can just do something that's not in the Constitution. He changed the Constitution, allowing himself to nationalize things, allowing himself to do many, many terrible power grabs. And after that happened, he started with the land takeovers. And you would say, didn't people resist? People resisted. People have been resisting in Venezuela since very early. Chavez didn't win overwhelmingly. Chavez won in December with like 54% of the vote. That is not an overwhelming victory, right? And so, and even then, there's evidence that he started cheating in the election since 2004. But you know, the only free election in a socialist government is the first election. After that, they stay in power, and that's why Venezuela's story is so important to America, right? America is not going to suffer like Cuba or the Soviet Union, a coup or a military overthrowing of the regime for some communists. In any case, it will be democratic like Venezuela, where the people will elect a government and then the government will never leave, which is what happened to us. And so that's what concerns me. So the land grab started, people went on hunger strikes. There was a very famous man, Brito was his last name, and you can Google him. He went on a hunger strike and died because the government took his farm. And there's been many owners. One of my best friends from, we have known each other since we were like 5 years old in preschool. And he lives in Spain now, thankfully. But his grandma owned a bookstore in downtown Caracas. Chavez, the president, just walked by and took it over. That's it. He said, you know, he pointed at it, and it's the government's. And this grandma lost this small bookstore that she had downtown. And this happened to so many people, large and small businesses. People resisted. People protested. There was even an attempt to overthrow him. The military overthrew him for a day in 2002. And it's still, you know, he came back. He purged then the institutions, the military, and everyone, and fired everybody who he didn't like. He even went on TV, read the equivalent of their social security numbers and named them and said, fired one by one to thousands of people. That's how bad Chavez was. And so people resisted, but it's hard when people don't have the guns to fight them and the elections are rigged, right? That's the difference. So I never had a second amendment. And so that's also why I'm more hopeful about the United States. The United States has a different history. It has many more people who are wary of these ideas, because in Venezuela, we were told Venezuela is in Cuba, right? They told us in the 90s. This is what my parents telling me. I watched videos back then too. Venezuela is in Cuba. Venezuela is not an island. Venezuela has oil. Venezuela is a democracy. We're the democratic leader of the region, because all the other Latin American countries were military dictatorships for much longer. All the political refugees went to Venezuela, not the other way around. We had 2 million Colombians living in our country as refugees from their civil war. And now it's the opposite. And so we were told that, and the reality is that today Venezuela is less free than Cuba economically. And Venezuela has 6 million refugees outside of its country instead of having them inside from other places. And so, yes, if it can happen to Venezuela, it can happen anywhere.
Right, and that brings me to my next question. I was reading your bio, and you talked about how, you know, when you came to college in America, you became worried about the influence of ideologies like communism and socialism, and that's what inspired you to kind of have this career as a speaker. So I was hoping you would talk a little bit more about that, kind of what it was like kind of going to America from Venezuela, and what you encountered, and kind of what inspired you to start speaking out.
Yeah. Well, I've wanted to come to the United States for a very long time, since I was a kid. I had visited when I was a kid, and I just saw a country where there was so much more order, security, and freedom. And I always remember when I was a kid and I had this conversation in Miami. I had traveled with my parents, and I was very little. and she was a Walmart cashier, and she was telling us about her day. It was in Spanish because, you know, Miami, everybody speaks Spanish and all of this. And she said that she was going on a cruise that weekend with her husband. And I was shocked, right? A Walmart cashier can afford to go on a cruise vacation in this country? That is unthinkable in Venezuela for middle-class people. How can a Walmart cashier do that in America? That was what said, wow, this is a great country, right? That she can do. And of course, what, maybe she paid $500 per person. Do you think she can save $500 and she doesn't have to pay a plane? The cruise goes to Miami. Of course she can afford that on a Walmart salary saving. So that's the kind of thing that really made me want to come to America, the history, all of these things, the prosperity. And so I got a full ride to come to the US. I went to Indiana University in Indianapolis, and remind you, this is a public university in a very conservative state. Yes, a liberal city, Indianapolis. Indianapolis had a Republican major until recently, though. And, it's a great place to live. I love Indianapolis. But I remember in my orientation in college, the first day, they made us do, I kid you not, a walk of privilege, such that, if you are a man, you have to take a step forward. If you're a woman, you have to take a step back. If you're Black, you have to take a step back. If you're white, you have to take a step forward. And say that in the United States, some people are oppressed because of their sex and gender and race and all of these things. And that's why, we need the government to equalize outcomes, because we'll never have equal opportunity because of discrimination. And that just ran counter to everything I believed in about this country and my experience here. Because that is not the case. It's not because of those things that you're better or worse off. It's because of your effort. It's what you do. Obviously there's discrimination, but in the United States, leftism is so tied to these cultural issues for a different reason. In Venezuela, it was the class warfare, right? Why was it the class warfare in Venezuela? Because that's how people were divided. It wasn't about race. It wasn't about sex in Venezuela. It was a very conservative country socially. But in the United States, because people want prosperity, they seek to divide us in a different way, because class isn't the best, the most politically convenient way for them to divide us. So they divide us by sex and race because it's just more politically convenient. It's what we call cultural Marxism. It's still Marxism. Instead of class warfare, it's race warfare. It's sex warfare. And it's divide and conquer, right? So that's what really made me concerned. I saw so many people who supported Bernie Sanders. I saw so many people who supported AOC. I even saw some leftist groups putting communist ads on the light poles on campus or something. I don't know if you call them that way, but in the walls. And I was just so shocked, right, that the people would do that. And so I started telling my story, talking with my classmates. I've always been very outspoken, and so that's why.
Thank you for sharing. And then my last question before I'll pass to Jewel and Jordan is, what do you kind of see as the future of Venezuela? How do you see it playing out in the next few years and in the future? Do you think they'll move away from socialism and kind of reach a breaking point, or would that happen peacefully, or do you see war? Just kind of what are you thinking?
Yeah, well, let me say something. Venezuela has already changed from when I left. Right now, most transactions in the country are made in US dollars, not in our currency anymore. So the people who make money in US dollars, which maybe half of the population has some sort of income in US dollars, either because their work gives them or because of remittances from those of us abroad, right? So those people are much less affected by inflation in the country. So that has stabilized the situation for about half of the population. The other half is not stabilized inflation-wise. But when people say Venezuela is better off, they really mean inflation went from 1,000,000% to 1,000%, which is still, more inflation than the US has had in like 200 years. So it is still pretty bad. The other reason is that because so many people have left, there's remittances coming into the country, and that has stopped this massive starvation that we were expecting. But it's becoming some sort of a stable situation like Cuba, right? A parasitic economy that doesn't produce anything. It exports all its talent and just lives off of a very small flow of remittances to stay alive. And that's what I'm afraid is going to happen to the country because of sanctions. This actually has been in part thanks to sanctions, because all the rich oligarchs who are part of the socialist regime can't come to the United States, can't go to Europe, can't go to the rest of Latin America to spend their wealth anymore. And so they say they might as well spend it in Venezuela, so they might as well fix some things, you know? And that's the political economy of what's happened. What do I think will happen in the future? I unfortunately don't think the regime will fall. I just don't view the incentive, you know, they're making a lot of money, Tova. You have to understand that socialism stopped being ideological a long time ago in Venezuela. And now socialism is simply a tool to keep the population poor and under their control. It's not that they are actually socialists anymore. They're not. They just want to make money and they don't care about human rights. But socialism is good to keep people poor and oppressed and thinking about what's next to eat instead of how to achieve freedom. And so that's what's happened. And I think that it will stay that way because they're making a lot of money from drug deals. They're making a lot of money from trafficking of other things. Hopefully, you know, something happens, you know, some kind of international, you know, intervention that would stop them from doing that. But I think that, you know, at least in the medium term, next decade, I don't view them falling.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for your time. I'll now pass on to Jewel and Jordan. To Jewel and Jordan.
Thank you all. Thank you for the very cool show so far. So my first question is a bit tangled up. So we always hear about socialists as having good intentions and their plan just doesn't work. And as I've gotten older and heard more stories like Venezuela, and I look at our politicians, whether local, like my zoning board at home, or Washington, D.C. politics, to me, it seems that the root of this at this fake virtue is more pernicious of trying to control others or trying to take something down because of deep-seated resentment for a number of reasons. But what is your opinion on that? Because I think how we tackle this changes whether we view these people as deep down have really good intentions or more so how I'm starting to see it.
Yeah. Well, I think you hit the nail in the head when you said that resentment. Socialism is fueled by resentment, which, you know, envy, resentment. And that's what happened in Venezuela in the 90s. There was a lot of resentment against the establishment, political class, who were also corrupt. And the country was, you know, it was doing not very well in the 90s, but it wasn't doing terrible. And it certainly was a paradise compared to today. So, but it was because of resentment, right? If you envy and you want to take from the rich, not because you want to help the poor, but just because you hate the rich, then of course you're going to support socialism, right? You know, you don't care that the poor are going to be poorer as long as the rich are also poorer. You know, it's Margaret Thatcher talked about that too, and I really love her. You know, she gave this speech in the House of Commons with her hands, and it's a very famous speech because she said that the leftists would rather the rich be richer and the poor be poorer as long as they are more equal. You know, they don't care about making the poor better off. And I've met people like that. I've met people who've told me that billionaires shouldn't exist, regardless of whether that helps poor people or not. They just think that we should take away money from billionaires because that's it. It's just too much money. They don't need it, they've told me. But what do we actually need? We don't need internet. We don't need books, really. Do we need books? Why? We really just need to eat, you know, and not die. You know, humans before civilization didn't even need clothing. Why do we need clothing? It's really that it's a slippery slope. What do you really need is subjective. Most things that we have are not needs, are just wants. And so I don't think that that's a philosophically consistent argument to say that because people don't need something, then they shouldn't have it. And so, yeah, I think it comes from resentment. Most people are not like that, though, guys, I'll say. I think most people who believe in these ideas, not the political class, but the people who vote for them, they actually want to make poor Americans better off. And they also are not, you know, informed very well about the facts. But the truth is that most of the electorate is not very well informed about the facts, regardless of their political leaning. yeah, I think it's a question of information, informing people about things. We just talked about the Nordic countries. Most people don't know the Nordic countries charge lower corporate taxes than the United States, or that they have 20% sales taxes. And if you told Americans, when Bernie Sanders says that he wants to make us like Denmark, that actually means a 20% sales tax and a 30% payroll tax, they would say, get away from me, right? Because the politicians are lying to them. They're telling them that you can finance this from the rich or printing money. And that's what Venezuela did, not what Denmark is doing. So if you actually want to make us like Denmark, then propose Denmark's policies, not Venezuela's. That's the problem. And then you see all these actors and all these politicians who are actually friends with the Maduro regime and friends with socialist dictatorships, not with the Nordic countries or European nations. The Democratic Socialists of America, the organization that sponsored AOC to become a member of Congress. You know where they were last Independence Day? They traveled to Venezuela. They went to meet with Nicolas Maduro. This is all online. They published themselves. This is a man who is sought by the Drug Enforcement Administration for narco trafficking, who is indicted and has a $15 million price on his head by the U.S. Justice Department. And they met with them in person, everything in the middle of the pandemic too, and so how can you tell me that you don't want to make America like Venezuela if you meet with Maduro and I don't see you meeting with the King of Sweden?
Yeah.
I'm just curious. So overall in Venezuela, I know you haven't been there in a few years, but what do the people think, like just the general public? And these people getting in power, is it just mainly being paid off, or is it just misunderstanding from the population? Like, what are they thinking now? Where are all of their heads generally?
Yeah, I mean, the overwhelming majority of the Venezuelan population is incredibly opposed to the regime that rules us. There just haven't been any free elections in the country in over a decade. Really, in over a decade, well over a decade. I have never been able to vote in a free election in Venezuela. At least in my lifetime, right? And also you have to remember the people who voted for Chavez back in 1988, Venezuela had a totally different population, much smaller than later. The people who are alive today that voted for Chavez back then are like 25% of the current population. So 75% of the Venezuelan people didn't even have the election in the first place of the regime that was in, and then they never had free elections to actually change it. So, I'm talking about the people who were 18 back in 1998, because below 18, they couldn't vote. So what I'm saying is that the Venezuelan people are heavily opposed. They just have no democratic ways to express it. You can see this in polls. You can see this by talking with anyone in the street. The people who do support them, there is a very small minority of people who actually benefit from the regime. Who are members of the military, who, they can manage the food supply and they help their families because they get the food first and things like that.
When you when you tell this story to people in America, and when you went through college, when you got here and you had to do that walk that you said you had to do, number one, how was that a blow to your psyche? And then number two, how have you talk to your classmates? Because Jordan and I just went through college. We graduated a little while ago. And
where did you go?
We went to Muhlenberg College and we transferred to Moravian College. So they're small private colleges in Eastern Pennsylvania.
Okay.
And pretty early on, we just became like, we just accepted in many classes being an anathema, and we kind of just enjoyed being, saying the thing that was unpopular, and then we went on our way, but we didn't really convince. The only thing we did really was that the kids who agreed with us would tell us outside of class, like, hey, by the way, that was cool, you said that.
That happened to me. Yeah.
But we didn't, I don't know if we convinced anybody of anything.
Okay, so this is important. A big problem in the American education system is that because not in all classes people do that, the students never see an alternate perspective, and everybody just thinks that what the professor says is true. So even if you don't persuade someone, you will stop the professor from persuading some people, and that is already a win. So don't view it as negatively as you said it. I think that you should be more optimistic about that. And that's what you should do. Every class where I had situations like that, I spoke up. I even had a professor, this was the worst of all. Like nobody liked him after that even because he was so offensive. He said that what happened in Venezuela was the fault of the United States and that it wasn't true that it was that bad as the media portrayed. And I'm like, are you crazy? Let's do something. I literally told him in front of the class, let's exchange houses. I'm going to live in your house and you're going to go to Venezuela. And let's see who does better. And let's see how many days you survive. Like, probably a little disrespectful, you could say, for a college professor, but he was a terrible professor in general. He wasn't very, he wasn't qualified. And he was just, insulting things of my country. Like, no, you can't say that. And so maybe I can say those things because I'm from there and because the left now will try to cancel everyone who, you're discriminating or whatever. And, they can tell that to me because I actually lived there. So, I encourage people, especially, people who come from other countries to speak up in class. And that's important. Even if you don't persuade people, because you just need to present an alternative perspective to stop the professor from actually brainwashing the students and thinking there's nothing else. So that's my 2 cents. Yeah.
Cool. I think it's audience time. I bet we have some cool audience questions, but I appreciate the show and definitely learned a lot about Venezuela. I didn't realize even things about like you said, the meeting that happened with the party that backed AOC. Didn't know about that.
Yeah.
Well, and thank you, Daniel. This has been really fascinating. And we do have quite a few audience questions here. Kay Beckman asks, do people in Venezuela have access to news and the internet?
Yeah, so that is a big challenge. So Venezuela used to have all of that. The advantage is that because, this, unlike Cuba, where the regime took over in Cuba before internet existed, so Cubans never had internet in the first place. Venezuelans already had internet when Chavez came to power, and it kept expanding in the first few years. The only problem was that now people became poor. So internet connection is bad and it's not widespread. But mobile smartphone use is widespread and people do have access to data. However, the government has taken over almost every single media outlet in the country. There's really very little left to oppose them. And so people use social media. I got informed when I was in Venezuela through Twitter, funnily enough. And you'd say, well, the government won't censor Twitter? They're not capable enough to do it yet. They're just too incompetent. They want to, but they just aren't able to. But yeah, people learn through social media about what happens.
Interesting. And then you address this a little bit, but Vincent Romano asked the question in a little bit of a different way. He says, am I correct in that you've spoken at colleges and universities? Have you encountered resistance from students? What have they said to you? And what is your reaction to Americans who support socialism?
Yeah, well, I've spoken to very different types of groups. So I've spoken to conservative groups on campus in which obviously there's really no resistance, but it's not really my favorite platform to speak. I've spoken at high schools where they just send all the students there. And so you actually get people who disagree with you and they're younger. So it's more important to reach them. And I've spoken at club events. So say like an economics club, right? Where there's no ideological exclusion. I've never had like a heckling or anything negative, I'll say, happen to me. I'm not famous where there will be a protest or anything like that. But I've had disagreements, and honestly, it's better. I like it when that happens. Usually in every event, there's at least one. Funnily enough, the most heated one was not even with a student, it was with a staff member who went to the event. But students usually, this is what's important about believing in freedom and spreading the word about free markets. We are usually reasonable people. And if you come from a place of good intentions, I want everybody in this country to be richer and prosperous and nobody to be poor. I don't want anybody to be poor. I don't think anybody wants anyone to be poor. And the question is, how do we get there? What policies do we put forward? And when you explain, actually, this is what Bernie Sanders is proposing, and this is what Denmark is doing. Actually, I like Denmark. So why don't we do what Denmark does? But that's not what Bernie Sanders is saying. I'm just giving an example. But I say things like that all the time. And so the people stay thinking, I'm like, actually, that's reasonable. Like, this is not some crazy guy, like they say, that just, doesn't care about the poor and doesn't believe in any government assistance. That's not true.
Well, that's great. And Susan Baker says, Daniel, you're wonderful. Thank you for speaking out and educating people. And she says, socialism and communism are spirit killers, creating zombies. You kind of said that earlier. Both systems sound like the idealized Federation on Star Trek. I often say the Federation is a lie. But Susan and several of our listeners ask, how do you reach your listeners, especially when they're closed-minded? And it sounded like you were talking a little bit about that in your previous answer, where you try to establish common ground and show that you're coming at people from really good intentions. But do you have any other ways that you people when they're closed-minded?
So usually when you go to speak an event, if people are really close-minded, they're just not going to be there. So it's not really something you can affect. I think that what we can affect, what you can affect, and what everybody here listening can do is in their daily lives. People are much more likely to be persuaded by their friends and people who they trust, not by strangers. And so talking about what talking about your stories, always giving the example, right? Because the left always portrays people on the right as mean, as racist, as bad. And just by giving the example of being a good citizen, you already debunk half of the myths of the left. And if that is, you already have halfway of the job done by being good. It's true. By raising your family well, if all the children of people who believe in freedom today believed in freedom and weren't brainwashed in schools and universities, then we also wouldn't even need to persuade more people, just their children. So do a good job with your family, be a good example in your community, and then everything else will be extra and will come easier.
Those are great tips. Claudia Guzman says, also, thank you. Totally impressed with all the knowledge of Daniel and how much I learned today. I'd like to know his point of view on the other countries in Latin America, like Peru. Thank you. And please keep spreading the word and your knowledge.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for that question. That's very important. I'm very concerned about what's happening in Latin America. We are seeing another pink tide, like what happened in the early 2000s, where a bunch of socialist governments take over the region. And I'm especially sad about this socialist wave in the region, in Peru, in Chile, in Argentina, in Brazil soon, and Colombia if we're unlucky, because now there are so many people who fled from Venezuela living in those countries that it's like deja vu, right? And I have many friends who live there. I have friends in Peru, in Chile, in Argentina, in Colombia, in all the Latin American countries, because 6 million fled, people from my high school friends are everywhere. And so Peru has a communist president who's actually a Maoist. He supports Mao from China, the guy who starved the most people in world history. And he said that one of his campaign promises was not just to become Peru a communist country, but he wants to deport all Venezuelans. And the reason he wants to do it is because he knows we don't believe in communism or socialism. And so he hates Venezuelans and he hates freedom. And so I'm very concerned. Chile is also in a situation like that. It's sad, it's kind of like, this is more of a joke between Latin Americans, but this is why you don't flee to another Latin American country, guys. That's why you come to the United States. We say it all the time, like, guys, you don't go from third world country to third world country, okay?
And then Lizette Flores has a logistical question. She wonders, due to the inflation and devaluing of currency in Venezuela, how do people carry around the large amount of money they need to buy things?
Yeah, good. I mean, for me, during my time, it was really bad. I couldn't fit enough cash in my wallet to buy an empanada in my school cafeteria. I have a picture, I didn't share it, but I have a picture of me holding a pack of cash like this in my hand, and that was the price of a movie ticket. Wow. Now that's not a problem anymore because people are using US dollars. People have just said, I don't care what the government thinks, we're going to use US dollars that we got from, in some way, there are not enough in circulation. I wish there were more. And that's a big obstacle in the economy, but people are just using US dollars, and that's how they overcome that. People are using even more. I'll tell you, not everybody has a computer or internet at home, but everybody has smartphones. And so they're even using mobile payment apps.
Well, thank you. And we're just about at the end of our time. And Janine, is there anything that you'd like to say or ask to wrap up?
If there's another, I'm happy to finish one question more if you don't mind.
Oh gosh, it's Janine. Does any? I just thought this, Daniel, you're just phenomenal. It's just been a phenomenal show. Does anybody have another question? Tova, Jewel, Jordan? I know Kathy has to hop off right at 3, and we won't stay too long.
It was great, Daniel. I
Okay,
do have to run, but
Kathy.
I'll let y'all. I'll leave y'all to it. Thank you so much.
All right, thank
Bye.
you. Anybody have? Oh, Jewel and Jordan. Oh, Jewel and Jordan are still there. You're square.
Yeah, we're here. I was thinking about if there was, I mean,
Well, you know,
I have a question. I have a question. Can you go into? Sorry, Jewel. I'll give you yours in a minute because
no, go ahead.
Go ahead, Jewel. I stepped on you. You were
No, I was saying that it's hard to pick one because we've just been listening the whole time. So Janine, you asked what you were gonna ask.
Well, okay, that's how I felt, Jewel. That it just popped in my mind. The older you get, when you pops in your mind and you can like hold on to that thought, it's a really exciting moment. Okay, Daniel, you keep talking about the Danish and the Denmark and Venezuela, and a lot of socialists are consorting with the Venezuelan leaders instead of going to Denmark. Can you kind of flesh that out a little bit, please?
Well, the Democratic Socialists of America is the largest youth left-wing organization in the country. We have 4 members of Congress who are members of this organization: Jamal Bauman, Rashida Tlaib, AOC, and I forget the name of this other congresswoman. She's also from New York. I just don't remember. Or no, she's not from New York. I don't remember her name. But there's 4 of them. I have a list. I can send it to you later. But they're all members of this organization. They are apologists of socialist regimes over the world. They're friends of the Cubans, of Nicaragua, of the Venezuelan regime. But this goes back to Bernie Sanders, who was the first guy of them back. He's been in politics since the 70s, 80s. This is a man who went on his honeymoon to the Soviet Union and said that despite the starvation, they had a very nice subway station, because people eat from the niceness of the walls of the subway station. Denmark. Okay, Denmark has school choice. Denmark has very high personal income taxes on the middle class and low income earners, as well as sales taxes. They have a lower corporate tax rate than the United States. I mean, they have great companies, just like the Swedish, right? I mean, IKEA is from Sweden, Lego is from Denmark. There's many companies who will move to those countries, not to America. Burger King is not even an American company anymore. Now they're headquartered in Canada. Why? Because they charge less in taxes for corporations. These countries are smart. You see, they know that citizens have a much harder time moving elsewhere, but companies can change their HQ much faster. And because of that, they know that they can make more money in taxes by charging less to corporations to keep them in their country and more to workers who aren't able to leave easily. And so that's how they obtain their tax revenue to pay for all their welfare spending, which you may agree or not with it. I think that it's too much. But even if it's too much, it's much better structured than America's welfare spending, which is very duplicative. That's it. They're less regulated. They don't have a minimum wage. It's all private and collective negotiations for salaries and benefits. That's very different from here. Denmark also has school choice. Even their single-payer healthcare system is different from what the Democrats propose here, because 1, they're the size of like a small US state, okay? It's not like 300 million people. But 2nd, the healthcare system is controlled by each municipality. So we're talking about, yes, it's government run, but it is so decentralized that you see counties basically competing with each other, counties of like a few thousand people running their own healthcare system. That's very different from having the federal government run the healthcare system of 300 million people, having the counties in each state do it, right? So there's still competition in the system. And that's why it's so different. You know, this has nothing to do with what the left proposes here. This is not taxes on the rich, this is taxes on the poor. And this is not this massive government program run at the federal level. It's actually very federalized.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. It's really interesting when the government, I'll just close with the businesses, lower business corporate taxes, and that's how they get the business.
And it's easier today, according to the World Economic Forum, it's easier to open a business in all of Nordic Europe, in Denmark, in Sweden, in Norway, in Finland, than in the United States. We're so overregulated. Really,
Yeah,
I mean, in many aspects, they're more capitalist than we are. So, I mean, it's really not as socialist to become like Nordic countries. They're really more capitalist than we are in many aspects.
As soon as you start wanting to start your own business and you get a little into your mid-20s or whatever, and you realize the regulation that the government is asking you to have a simple little business, that's when it hits home. That's when you go, oh, this is what regulation is. I have to do what? And I have to do what? And the last thing I'll say is I'm in New York City right now, and you can see when they want to have construction done on a building, there are about 50 permits that they have to put up on the glass window. 50 permits from this and this and this. Oh gosh, well, you've been fantastic. Well, I know we need to let everybody go, but Daniel, thank you for your time. Thank you for all that you're doing to spread your firsthand testimony of what life has been like for you. And I look forward to meeting you in person here in New York City over a cup of coffee. So Tova and Jewel and Jorn and Aubrey, you want to say your salutations as well?
Yes, appreciate the great show, Daniel. Keep it up.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
It was really awesome. You're a great speaker today.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Tova. Thank you, Aubrey, Janine, Jorn, Jewel, everybody. Thank you for coming. And also, if you're, I'd love if we can stay in touch. You can follow me on social media. I'm on Twitter at Daniel Di Martino. It's just my first name and last name. Let me, it's so it's Daniel and then DIMARTINO. And, Instagram, Facebook, my website, feel free to get in touch. I answer questions. I speak at events and yeah, thanks.
Good for you. All right. We'll check all that out. Tova, you're going to talk about next week's show.
Oh, was I? Okay. Well, I hope you all tune in. If you enjoyed today's show, please tune in next week at also the same time, 2 p.m. Eastern. Every Tuesday, we do a constitutional chat, and we're continuing our series on the economy. So hope to see you all there.
Yes, sorry, Tova. I thought you were informed. It's America's National Debt 101. That's what we're talking about. We're going to talk about the debt and then the deficit. Aren't we learning so much in our series on the economy? All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Aubrey. Thank you, Daniel, Jewel, and Jordan, Tova. Y'all have a great day. Bye.